So obviously, today's show comes to you on the tip of the iceberg of tariffs, right? What else is anybody going to be talking about over the next little bit? Tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. But today, we're going to bring you some in-depth knowledge into tariffs and what they're doing to our industry, what they're doing to our market, and what it means for us as Canadians and Americans in the North American freight market. Today on the Logistics Life. Hey there, my friends. Dean. Buddy. So I look at what happened yesterday, and for all of those coming to us today, we've decided to go on Data Day on Tuesday because I think this represents a major thing. Dean, yesterday in the period of 8 hours, we saw triple-digit losses on every single stock market, Canadian, US. Every single one. We have $155 billion of counter tariffs about to hit the market today. Yeah. We have 50%, like Ontario government, Doug Ford is saying 50% of military and US manufacturing needs Ontario's high-grade nickel, and he's just going to cut it off.
And the power.
Cut power. So Minnesota, New York,
right.
And I forget the third state in the US,
right,
is almost 100% reliant on Canadian hydro power.
Yep.
He's going to cut that off. Aluminum, steel, and lumber, he's going to cut that off. Now, US military, 70%, just about over 70% from my latest findings of their aluminum and steel come from Quebec.
Right.
So you think of that, that's huge. Immediate retaliation starting today. The Canadian government's talking about 30 billion to hit 25%, then followed by the remaining 125 billion within the next 4 or 5 days.
Yeah.
Companies like Nvidia lost $240 billion from 9:39 a.m. to 3:27 p.m. yesterday. I'm going through this. I spent hours last night and this morning, as you and I just talked about, up earlier than normal.
Yeah.
Some people are like, what the hell?
Yeah.
I'm looking at some of these impacts on the US economy.
Right.
It could raise consumer prices by 0.5 to 0.7%, pushing inflation closer to 3% this year. Economic growth is estimated to reduce U.S. GDP growth by 0.6 to 1% over the next year, with risks of stagnation if tariffs persist.
Yep.
Stagflation risk, the combination of higher prices, slower growth, disproportionately affect low-income households. Now, I think this is the big one that not a lot of people are talking about. So we're talking about low-income consumers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at I guess for lack of a better word, the tiers in the economy, higher costs for the essential low-income households are disproportionately affected by increased prices on necessities like food. Now, here's the interesting fact, and kind of got me thinking and saying, whoa, how many people have we really thought about these people? Okay. Tariffs tariffs will actually affect the poorest the most. They're saying up to 4% of their income, as opposed to the 1% now. So an additional 3%, whereas compared to the 2% for wealthier. So low-income housing, obviously, or low-income families, obviously based on the amount of money they make, are now going to be spending 4% more. Now, you think about this.
It's a bigger percentage of their discretionary income.
Yeah. And right now, as it sits, both in US and Canada, now I'm not sure about Mexico, but I know US and Canada for a fact, low-income housing, they're literally at the end of the month scraping 2 nickels together to figure out how they're going to make it to the next check.
Yeah.
And when you start thinking about that and you think about the cost of food and everything, I mean, so to me, it's just mind-blowing. And I understand, and I'd love your thoughts on this, because I mean, obviously this is political, Dean, but also I want to try and stay away from the political aspect of it. I don't know if we can. I know the originating factor of this for one fold is, fentanyl and immigration. And I know the second piece of this is a lot of from the reports I read, and I'd love your thoughts on it. Tariffs are one of the things that a president can implement, executive orders and tariffs, without anybody's input, kind of thing. So without Congress passing the bill or whatever it is.
Yep.
And I understand why, or from what, and again, we have to be very careful here, right? Because it's what's published that we can gain access to, right? And, you know, fake news, whatever the case may be, we go by what we read, and hopefully all of you out there are reading multiple sources, and then coming to your own thought process on it. But I look at it and I say, you know, the three largest trading partners on the planet are fighting against each other.
Right.
And I understand that there is a drug issue in North America as a whole, US, Canada, Mexico, probably globally, because it's not just something constricted to our area of the world. I get that fully. I just don't understand how tariffs are going to make the US manufacturing engine better.
Right. Yeah, they won't. I mean, that's been well documented, Dan. This is you raise input costs of imports. So you raise input costs, you raise production costs. Companies either pass on those prices, and we pay for it as consumers through higher prices and inflationary costs. Or if they don't pass it on, and this is what I think a lot of people miss, if a company absorbs those costs, what does the company do if their profit margins decrease? They cut costs and lay people off and slow down production lines. So at some point you get to, whenever you start to raise input costs or manufacturing costs, you get to a point where people reduce the amount of money they're buying. And for all of us in trucking, that just means less freight to haul. And you've only got to look at 2018, 2019 tariffs, documented research that showed the impact of tariffs. They looked at three things, right? Outputs, production costs, and some of the reduced competitiveness. And they found that the 2018-19 tariffs on aluminum steel in particular showed a net loss of jobs. And that sector led to that change in that sector led to downstream industrial level, overall job losses. So there's research that shows that, we've seen this movie before. Right, we knew that this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, because this was talked about during the election campaign. In fact, much higher than 25% was talked about if you go back and look at the data, right? So this isn't a surprise to anybody. I think those that have been studying the data objectively would have said this is going to cause inflationary, this will push prices up, this will reduce our competitiveness with overseas countries. And I give you a really good example, right? So that's sort of the extent of my political statement, which is we knew this was coming. So you shouldn't be shocked. Not you, but everybody else, because you and I have talked about this at length. Reuters had a really good article. Remember 2019, we had 2018, we had the tariffs come in, China was affected. So China's been diversifying its supply sources since the 2018 tariffs came in to reduce dependency on US goods. Brazil has overtaken US as the biggest supplier of agricultural products. So since 2018, or in fact, since the peak of the pandemic, our China's imports of US products has dropped 25%. Brazil has increased 25%. So China's biggest market for US agricultural products, right? So you think about soya beans and beef and pork, is now Brazil, not the US. So what happens with this is these changes become permanent as countries seek to diversify their supply chains. Canadians are going to do exactly the same thing when it comes to oil. Don't be surprised if you see the pipeline all the way to St. John to export Canadian crude. So countries will look to diversify away, just like China has diversified away for US agricultural products. What does that mean? It means less refrigerated containers of pork going out of Oakland to China. Oakland's our biggest export port for frozen meat. You're going to see less trucks running out of the Midwest with pork and beef. lower demand for those sort of products. So it's like a trickle down effect all the way through the entire economy. And I think that means that these changes are so aggressive because, Warren Buffett said tariffs are an act of war, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a trade war, right? China came out today and said, hey, any time you put tariffs on it, that's an aggressive move. And I think what countries do is they say, you've done it to us once before. This time it's a lot more than what happened last time. And now it's happened to our closest trading partners, which, by the way, the old NAFTA agreement was rewritten by the current administration. So now suddenly it's not in favor. And I think what countries like Canada do, right, in particular, some of these changes are going to be long-term and sustained. So short-term, right, what we're seeing is a massive surge of freight across the border that had to be in before midnight last night, otherwise it'd be rejected. So rates have been off, through the roof. What that means is March is going to be dismal. Like, Dan, March is going to be a pretty bleak month for a lot of those cross-border carriers because the volume's already been moved. And when you have that sort of volatility, you've still got fixed costs. The increased rates won't have been enough to offset the lower production for the month of March. So I think short-term pain is going to be inevitable, but long-term, you'll start to see significant shifts in where freight moves. And that's sort of the worst-case scenario for us. You and I talked about this is, US consumers, we have what we call demand destruction, where people just stop buying. They reduce the amount of expenditure because prices go up. We were already on shaky ground, right? Before the current administration came in, we were recovering, right? Things weren't great, but we were on the right trajectory, even though we were still bottoming out and trying to find our way forward. Now you look at the outlook and you think there's so much uncertainty. I just think it leads to the inevitability of another freight recession. I don't know how that doesn't happen, absent some sort of miracle, because we were already seeing lower freight volumes year over year. So the trajectory is for that to continue and now possibly to worsen because we've already brought all of our imports in. We've had a record January. Canadians have been moving a boatload of freight across the border, like literally moving so much tonnage. That means things are going to be pretty quiet. Even with all of that volatility, Dan, rates still dropped last week nationally, right? So we're not seeing any lift in rates. The data point that
nationally maybe, but I could tell you
regionally,
our rates have, oh my Lord.
Yeah.
I mean, to the point where, and I'm pretty sure I sent you a screenshot of a couple of texts I got last week. Yeah. And it was crazy how many sales reps were reaching out to me saying, what are you seeing? How, I'm experiencing this. And I remember my team and I had a conversation and it was crazy. Almost to the point where carriers were picking up and then calling us and saying, hey, listen, man, something's happened. I need an extra $1,000.
Yeah.
And and every one of us was kind of going, what the heck is happening here? Across the board from our business. And we're talking about almost every state in the US to almost every province in Canada, we were seeing shifts. I don't know how the national needle didn't move.
It's because it's the cross-border volume is a small percentage of the overall.
Yeah.
So regionally, there was a lot of volatility, but it didn't move the national needle, which is sort of something I always watch and say, well, how big of an impact did it have? Hurricanes kind of affect a bigger region, but the Southeast is one of our biggest flatbed regions. So it moves the national needle quite easily. Road check week, affects us nationally. Cross-border volumes are a very small percentage, albeit a critical one. So I think you're going to see. I think your automotive industry is one that I think is in for a rough ride because.
Well, it's interesting you say that. So I'm looking at a Wall Street Journal report here.
Same one, yeah.
Oh, you read that one too? So Canada-Mexico loan could add. So the levies on Canada and Mexico can add about $3,000 to the average price of a new vehicle. At $44,000, just an average price of a vehicle at $44,000 is already up by 25% since 2019. So I look at this and they said about 23% of new passenger vehicles sold last year in the US were assembled in
Yeah.
Canada or Mexico.
Right.
Car makers, including Volkswagen, Stellantis, Honda, General Motors, have above average resilience on the two countries. Now, this is an interesting part. Tesla,
Yeah.
which is run by obviously Trump ally Elon Musk, builds US sold cars domestically, but about a fifth of their parts come from Mexico.
Yeah.
So, right. And I'm thinking about this and I'm saying, okay, yes, I understand that. I mean, I know Elon, this, as much as the guy is amazing for the world, a very smart individual. I don't want to get into that. There's very few people in the world that can afford Teslas, right? Even the low end Teslas. And I look at this and I look at somebody who is in the car market, myself. I'm blown away at the cost of vehicles. Like they're a depreciating asset. That's sorry, they're a depreciating. They're not even an asset.
Right.
They're a liability.
Right.
They depreciate like what's the number? 33% when you pull it off the lot or something crazy. Like it's massively depreciating.
Yep.
We need them to get around.
Right.
And I just look at it and I say, this is crazy. Like the average vehicle cost is like $700.
Right.
Just to drive a normal vehicle. And I speak to people all the time. They're like, I would never do it. I look at like, you know, me, I'm a huge snowmobiler.
Yep.
Snowmobiles went from like $10,000, $12,000 to $20,000, $27,000, $28,000.
Right.
So, and it's interesting because my wife and I were talking about this last night. There's in the group that I'm in with our snowmobile club. Okay. There was 42 days in Southern Ontario, 42 days of trails being open. They're closed today.
Right.
So if you take that 42 days and you take a snowmobile, you pay $300 for $250 for a permit every year. You pay insurance for 12 months when you drive it for 40 days.
Yep.
You can't drive it for 40 days because we have work, we have commitments, we have all of this.
Yep.
You look at that window and then you look at the cost to run that. Right. These are things that impact us as a society. So you think of how many people are employed by the likes of Polaris, BRP, major piece. Now, obviously, both of these companies have summer recreational vehicles, but a big piece of it is snow. You know, Arctic Cat, Yamaha, both getting out of snowmobiles. Right. So you look at that. You look at like golf, for example. You think of how much the prices are going to increase for golf balls, for golf clubs, for caddies, for golf carts at golf clubs, right? And then you look at grass seed, you look at all of these things. I don't think very many people have a grasp on the amount things are going to rise. It's I don't know what that fallout's going to be, Dean, but I mean, you look at us, for example, for Canada, right? I know years ago there was a big push on, it was probably 2019, where there was a big push on the EU, right? Canada and European Union created new deals where very cheap, like I see a huge shift coming. Canada being more pro-Canada. You look at what's happened over the last couple of weeks. There's been, I think the latest report that I saw was like a 37% increase in military signups in Canada. Obviously Canada's now got a renewed vigor, if you will, to build up a military. So does all these other places. They're all saying, no, we're going to start investing in our military, because now I want to look at both sides, right? I don't just want to be Canada specific, but and I look at that, and I've read reports where, you know, World Health Organization, Trump was talking about investing $500 million in 2024. You know, the US has 500 million people. China has 1.3 billion. They put in 35 million. So I know there's like, we know, and I think no matter what you read, no matter if it's left, right, indifferent, doesn't matter. There is an imbalance in what the US pays out, right? For example, Canada is not paying their share for military, right? US is saying, okay, guys, you think we're going to protect you if something happens. I mean, I see maybe smaller terrorist attack, but really when it comes to North America, is anyone going to try and take North America? I don't think so. I mean, that's a little far-fetched. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. But I look at all these things, and yes, there is offsets, right? That there is saying, okay, we pay this. Everybody's supposed to pay this. We're here. You're here. That is an offset. You do need to make people act. I get that. And if we look at just Canada, and I can only speak for Canada, Trump said we're going to put a 25% tariff on everything if you don't fix your border and fix the drug crisis and immigration. Okay. So we got Blackhawks. We have a $1.3 billion package together to increase border protection, Canadian military, and all this kind of stuff. He said it's not enough. I get all of that. And has Canada become complacent? Probably. Right. I'm not an expert in it, but I do know I come from a military family, and my family has said for years, we're so far behind the 8 ball, right? On jets, on fighters, on equipment. Like when I was a young kid, 6 and 7, we would go to Nova Scotia and we would go and get on destroyers and do a day. And these were like the state of the art stuff. Well, 40 years later, I think they're still floating and we haven't upgraded, right? Or there's been pieces that haven't been upgraded. So I get all of that. I get the fact that the US has overspent on DOD and with Doge and all these things that they're finding out, and all the scams, and everybody just dipping their hands into the government's pocket, right? Because it's almost an unlimited source. I get all of that. I guess the big question for me that I'm still trying to answer is sending all 3 countries into a deeper recession. Let's forget about a freight recession. Let's just look at a recession. Let's look at job losses for people that really can't afford job losses. Real issues as you lose your job, but everything gets more expensive. I mean, all of these things are a recipe for complete disaster. Now, what happens during complete disasters and what happens during these times? Crime rises, drug use rises, like all of these things will go up instead of go down. So the question I have is this kind of counterintuitive, Dean? I don't know.
I think it's inevitable what's going to happen. I mean, you laid it out beautifully. Think about all of so a lot of immigrants have decided to go back to where they were from, right? I can't wait for someone to say, anyone that's come in on a H-1B visa like me, you no longer have citizenship. Like, wait for that shoe to drop. Me, 25 years. Wait for that one to come down, because we are all seen as the enemy, right? Which is like, Dan, I can't tell you how bad this is for immigrants, right? And I think what you miss is there's like 1 million federal workers that live in red states, right? You start to lay off people in red states like that's happening now, there are less people that are going to buy things at their local store. Less people are going to send their kids to childcare. It's happening in the private sector in North Carolina, where US aid companies, even though the money is spent overseas, there's a lot of employees within the US that work for companies in the US to drive the process that ends up with international aid. So you lay off people in North Carolina that were aid workers, part of US aid. It means you've got less people contributing to the economy. You have mass deportation. You have less people contributing to the economy, less people buying things, less people buying cars. So I think there's a flow-on effect of all of this that I don't think people looked far enough beyond campaign rhetoric, right? Because all of this has consequences. You can't just say, oh, we're going to impose tariffs on countries and suddenly fentanyl production is going to stop. Well, we know most of it comes from China, right? And we know it's not crossing the border in trucks, yes. But tell me, where's the press release that says we're going to inspect 100% of shipping containers that come into every port in the country? Shipping containers. Or every single truck that crosses the border. Like, how many trucks are being scanned that cross, Moulton or is it Moulton, the bridge, your crossing zones out of Canada? Like, Dan, I've been through that crossing thousands of times in my truck. I've been checked once, right? They're not looking at. I don't know they have the manpower to look at every single load. Like if you're a cross-border,
I don't think we do. I mean, I know there's scanners now at a lot of borders, and everyone goes through a scanner, but I mean,
But that's the answer, though. If you're going to really get serious about this, it's got to be 100%. Like, you can't just say, because I've been there, and I've been with the log haulers and the wood chip haulers that go back and forward every day. They just wave them through, right?
Mhm.
I've got Nexus, right? So, I mean, Dan, I came back from overseas, and so I've got global entry. So all my biometrics are in the system. I got nothing to hide. And when you walk into Los Angeles airport, you look at a camera, and I'm not joking, within 20 seconds, I didn't talk to a person. I was through US customs into the US. So that's so you think about that. How easy was that for me to come in with my bags and move straight through?
Mhm.
So you would hope, though, that all of my biometrics and all the background checks and everything like that have vetted me as a, legitimate traveler. But this notion that we're going to stop everything happening across our borders is like really naive, because that's not where the problem is. It's not at the borders, right? If you talk about fentanyl specifically, that's not where it's come. If China's the largest producer of fentanyl, how is it getting here? It's not crossing the border like in a truck necessarily. I mean, it probably does eventually at some point, but think through what are the logistics of that? How do you move it from China across the Trans-Pacific to the US? Like, how are they doing that? That's the part I don't understand in this whole debate, is why we think that we're going to have a tariff trade war with our best trading partners and not complete the whole picture. Like, so Dan, the other thing you'd want to say is, well, we're going to employ another 40,000 more CBP patrol officers at our border crossings to check all the trucks and trailers. I haven't heard that one yet.
No, and if you do, then I see that anyways as being somewhat of the same thing Ontario put into place,
right?
After the pandemic, because we have a real shortage of healthcare workers.
Exactly.
Well, they're expediting people,
right?
And if you take a look at, and don't get me wrong, obviously, I'm a big advocate for healthcare workers after what I've been through and all that. So I'm not making that statement for everybody watching or listening. But the fact is, you have more collapsed veins. You have more people that don't understand what they're doing. You have more people that are thrown into the lion's den without like the proper training and proper walkthrough.
Right.
As you know, let's take it from a business perspective. When you bring somebody new in, it takes you twice as long to get things done because you're training them at the same time. So no matter what happens in business, and you know it as well as I do, Dean, and let's look at it in the logistics perspective. Okay, so we'll bring it back to our industry. Dispatch. You bring in a new dispatcher, productivity goes down. There's more workload on everybody while that individual gets built up to speed. It's reality, and that's reality in every part of a business. Accounting, manufacturing, line work, it doesn't matter. People need to be trained on specific things. So there's this huge lull, right? So things will get worse before they get better. Hence the reason why a lot of companies, I'm a huge advocate for, we bring people in before we need them. So when they get trained up, they're ready to go. Now, obviously, in our market, you look at some of the things happening. You look at what's going on our market. You look at all of the stuff they're talking about when it comes to logistics, right? Kuehne+Nagel numbers down. Everybody's numbers are down. The individual you were talking about that was on your show, that's moved from a 20,000 to 2,000. That's had to let go a lot of people. Like, you look at the issues in logistics. Okay, logistics. 12% of the global GDP. Nothing moves without a truck. Everyone watching or listening can do a 360, and everything they see has pretty much touched a truck. Right. And this, to me, is the nucleus of every economy, is logistics. I mean, you talked about it when you went to India. As massive as that country is, as many people as they have, logistics is still a core function, because we don't eat without logistics. We don't drink without logistics. We don't have infrastructure upgrades without we don't have anything without logistics. And when an industry of our caliber is being fragmented left, right, and center, all it does is open up doors for like catastrophe down the road.
Right. I don't know. this is one of the more perplexing things that I've ever seen, right? It's like it's not, a lot of it's not grounded in reality.
It feels like it, yeah.
Well, but what happens is when you tell a lie often enough, it kind of becomes fact. And if you do it for multiple years, a lot of people believe it. And I saw some posts on social media this week about Ukraine and Zelensky and the US paying all this money. Don't forget, the US has been regarded as that, shining light on the hill, that's sort of a beacon of strength that everybody looks to. That comes with a cost. And it comes with a cost of supporting everyone else. It's not transactional. It's not that Canada should pay more. It's just that we've got 10 times the population and we should support Canada, right? We should support other countries. So that's the country's role, right, as this mega powerhouse of doing good for people in the world, not this current approach where we're going to have this isolation approach, because, Dan, this is going to leave us on an island. And I'm waiting for Canadians to say, hey, you know what? We're going to build stronger relationships with Europe. We're going to build stronger relationships with China. We're going to build stronger relationships with our Mexico people, because Mexico and Canada took a punt on free trade, right, when they got into this whole deal. And rightly or wrongly, it's worked for all of us because it's reciprocal, right? We all benefit from cross-border trade, automotive, oil, all those sorts of things that each of the countries depend on for our goods. That all people are employed by all of that. Like, there's all jobs that are created by all of this cross-border trade. So I think the long-term ramifications of this, if this is a long trade war, the long-term effects of this are lasting and will last well beyond this current administration's term. Because this is, when you're talking about trade policy, I think you're playing a long game. But I think a lot of people think this is a very short transactional game. And I don't think people really fully appreciate how much damage has already been done by what's happened, particularly with Canadians.
I agree. It's interesting you said that, because one of the things, as you know, our present prime minister is stepping down on the 9th.
Yeah.
And there's that, they're talking about obviously an election coming really soon after.
Yep.
Every side is talking about, first thing they're going to do is go to Mexico and create a new relationship with the Mexico government.
There you go. Okay.
Right.
I wasn't
and
aware.
Then you have IT bonds where we can travel right through the US, in transit bonds, travel right through the US. Tariffs will not apply. And part of, I start looking at that and saying, okay, that's present. Or is that legislation going to change now? Because, right, it will, obviously, because now we can travel through, and yes, do we still have to pay taxes on mileage through states? Yes, all of that. But it's kind of, so it's as if when these tariffs we're talking about on China, I remember back in 2019, when they put a tariff on China, customers that I had that pulled freight from China, we started having conversations about putting a warehouse in Canada and calling it, North American trade instead of overseas trade. And how does that work? Quickly caught on that the certificate of origin still says China. It will be taxed accordingly, whether you're right. So when this time came around, the same conversation happened.
Right.
I speak to companies all the time. There's companies out there where they're looking at what's actually being tariffed. Perfect example was a company that imports bags from China. And the owner sat back and said, okay, well, what's not being tariffed? And they said packaged goods. So he bought and put stick figures in the bags. Now it's a packaged good instead of a package. And to that nature, I won't give the exact details away, but to that nature. And in my head, I'm going, that's ingenious. And that company's avoided tariffs for all these years. Now that's changed, right? So I agree 1000% with you on the fact that once these connections, roots, neurological things change, like I look at it like a brain, right? You have one connection and you go and build another connection. It almost sometimes makes this connection irrelevant. And I think that's what's going to happen. I think the longer this goes on, I agree with you, where I think a lot of damage is done because, you look at our perspective and being a consumer in Canada, I say to myself, well, if that can happen this quickly, what else can happen this quickly,
Yeah.
right? And we start, almost like going down that mental rabbit hole, if you will. We were following that white rabbit down a bad hole, and I don't know. It's this fact that companies are going to resource where they get their products from.
Yeah.
Once that happens, you're right. It's very likely never to return to what was.
Well, I think that trust is a big part of this, right? And I'm perplexed at this ongoing debate about fentanyl, and I don't want to oversimplify it, about Canada's involvement, right? So the reality is, when you look at CBP data, 98% of the fentanyl that comes into the US is repackaged in Mexico and shipped across the southern border. Like about 1% of it comes from Canada. So I don't understand this implication that suddenly, Canada's tied up in this massive importation of this dangerous drug into the US. Like, it seems disproportionate. And so I don't understand the proportionality of the tariffs on one of our best trading partners. Like, to me, it's nonsensical to do this. And I think from a freight perspective, to really simplify this, we've seen freight rates. So if you look at freight rates from the USA to Canada, are up 18% since the election, 6% in the last 2 weeks. From your side, Dan, to the US, rates are up 7% since the election, 5% in the last 2 weeks. Like, reefer rates, USA to Canada, up 35% since the election. Toronto to Indianapolis, up 40%, 30 cents a mile in the last week. So what goes up is going to come down. So you want to bet that all that freight that's been moved just means that, when we normally get into March and April, we're looking for an uplift in the market. Dan, it's not there.
No,
because we still have excess capacity.
Because here's one of the biggest challenges, and I spoke to quite a few carriers prior to our conversation today.
Yep.
The biggest thing for them is we've raised the rates. Now, again, anyone in Ontario will tell you the abundance of equipment in Ontario, the concentration of carriers, and especially in the GTA, is asinine. Like, I don't even understand how a lot of them make money, because there's literally four times the amount of trucks to freight, but somehow they're all doing something. But what's happening is, over the last week, and I could speak to the last week because this is huge, carriers are saying, yes, there's an influx, but we don't know if we're getting a load. So we're going to raise the rate. So if, God forbid, something happened, like anyone
a load back
in the US, they're going to come back empty. So we have, yesterday we had a huge push by customers saying everything has to clear customs by midnight.
Right.
The amount of traffic watching things happen, I was sleeping, so I, full transparency, 9:30, 10 o'clock, Dano's out. But it's like, I'm looking at it and I'm saying, okay, I wake up this morning and I'm watching the emails pour in. And as I'm looking, I've got 26 emails right now still sitting there. People saying, did it cross? Did it cross? Did it cross? And today, very slow day coming out of the US. Now, that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation, in speaking with customers over the last 2 weeks, majority of customers are like, well, it is what it is. We have products that the US companies are buying. We're still shipping. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter to us. In the end, yes, does everybody pay more? But it has, so there's both polarities, right? Like, you think of the pharmaceutical industry, for example. Do you think that's going to stop because of tariffs? Not a chance. Not a chance. Because people need pharmaceutical products. People, food. Yes. Is it going to get more expensive? For sure. Are things going to happen? For sure. But are people going to stop eating altogether and go on 60-day hunger strikes? No. Like, so there's, even things like President's Choice is saying, okay, they're talking to all of their suppliers and saying, how are we going to mitigate this to keep the consumer's costs as low as possible? Don't get me wrong. Companies need to make a certain margin. I think a lot of times in trade, and I'll talk specific to logistics, we talk to customers and customers don't think logistics companies or carriers should make X margin, call it 15%. But I often say, because as you know, I'm very transparent. I say to customers, we put 15, 17, sometimes 20% on, depending on what is needed. Okay. Well, that's a little excessive. And my question is, okay, well then Walmart wants a 50% margin. Costco only operates at a minimum of a 35% margin. Canadian Tire is a 50% margin.
Right.
So margins are part of business.
Right.
Right? Like, I get it.
Yeah.
The one cost that people don't associate with positivity is freight costs.
Right.
But in my opinion, freight costs is just as important as, or just as critical as manufacturing costs.
Of course.
Because the fact is, you can build the greatest product on the planet. If you can't get it into a customer's hand, it's a shit product.
Yeah.
Call a spade a spade.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know, Dean.
Let me lay some numbers on you, Dan, here, because this is a fascinating discussion. I've just looked at Ontario rates while you were chatting there. So Ontario, outbound Ontario, volumes are up 55% last week. Rates are up 18 cents a mile. Similar effect on the Chicago and Joliet lanes. Inbound into Ontario from the US, up 64% last week, up 31 cents a mile. So when you start to look at the surge, now we're still not back to anywhere near where it was before the pandemic. Like we're still sort of, hovering around some pretty mediocre rates at a region, a province level. But look at Toronto to Chicago, Dan. Volumes are up 57% last week. Toronto to Joliet, volumes are up 65%. Toronto to Montreal, volumes are up 46%. So there's a ton of freight, literally a ton of freight moving around, right? But that just means that we're just pushing it around in the warehouses. Dan, a good friend of mine, Tom Cooper, said that he's got US customers trying to absorb a 200% increase in warehouse inventory. Like when you do that sort of stuff, absent demand, you're just trying to bring stuff in, there's a cost to that, right? So I think I think this doesn't end well if this is a long, drawn-out trade war, particularly for...
One of my customers is at 190% capacity.
Wow.
Because they wanted to get things in prior to trade.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because I'm having a conversation with him and I said, so my question is this, like an extra 10% got put on China as well.
Right.
And I know that's in comparison, it's kind of sitting in the background, right? Because of the Canada and Mexico. And I said, but at what point does that 10% make more sense than buying at $1.90 a square foot, $2.10 a square foot, 95 cents a square foot, depending on which market you warehouse in, depending on how in need, you were talking about an individual you were speaking with where behind her is a 20,000 square foot warehouse empty. You go to that warehouse and say, I got 5,000 square feet. I'll give you 90 cents a foot. They might take that because it's empty. So it's something. It's kind of like a driver taking a backhaul just for fuel and driver wages just to get home kind of thing, right? But you look at that increased cost. At what point do the scales tip?
So Dan, I could tell you, I just come back from Australia. People rubbing their hands at the idea of selling more wheat and cotton to China, right? Because China just came out yesterday, 15% tariff on chicken, wheat, corn, and cotton from the US, additional 10% on sorghum, soybeans, pork, beef, aquatic products, fruit, veggies, and dairy products. So you want to bet that other countries are looking at this and saying, wow, I see an opportunity here to increase our production and trade share of exports to China. Like, this is not rocket science, Dan. We've seen this movie play out before. And a lot of truckers were hoping for a freight demand recovery this year. And even if things don't get worse, that'll still be bad, right? Because we've still got excess capacity. I was looking at our data yesterday. The average operating cost to run a truck in the US is up about 18 cents a mile compared to pre-pandemic levels. Rates are 4 cents a mile above pre-pandemic levels. So carriers, it's costing a lot more to run trucks these days. Dan, it's probably costing you a lot more to run your snowmobile these days. I know it's costing you to do everything.
Unreal.
So what that does is it's this squeeze that's going on, right? And I think a lot of people are being squeezed, and they have been for most of last year, even part of the year before. And at some point, you get to a breaking point where if you don't start to see things improve on the horizon, I think a lot of people say, I can't sustain this anymore. We've cut so much cost out of our business. We've laid off as many people as we can. We put people on temporary 1099 contracts. We bring them in when we can afford them, when there's business there, and then we lay them off. We're already in furlough season in trucking. Like, think about all your gravel haulers. If we haven't had a bumper snow season, those dump truck drivers, a lot of them get furloughed all through January. You start to run into pretty tepid business construction, building season, planting season, just less freight to run around. And I think that's sort of my fear, is that we were just recovering. We're still on shaky ground. The numbers were improving, albeit very slowly. And Dan, we've still got excess capacity in the market, and particularly reefer and flatbed in the contract market. Large carriers still have excess capacity. And I think that those rates are still heading south. When you look at contract rates in recent RFPs, that capacity market in the US is still, they're still pretty loose. There's still a lot of loose capacity, and shippers still have pricing power. So even before this, we still weren't on the path to recovery as a freight market. And I think this uncertainty, when we look at the people that create demand for us, it just looks even more bleak. I mean, I hate to be pessimistic about this, but I just, a year ago, Dan, we were saying we don't see any green shoots on the horizon that will change demand fundamentally. But that was a year ago. Well, it's even more pessimistic now when you look at all of the economic forecasts that are coming out. We had Paul Bingham from S&P Global Intelligence on our show a little while ago. This is before tariffs, said we're already downgrading our GDP estimates this year. And I think after this, they'll probably downgrade them even more in terms of where they think how they think the economy will grow. Not a good scenario.